Welcome to Conflict Managed. I'm your host, Mary Brown. Conflict Managed is a weekly podcast about toxic work environments and how to fix them. We're glad you're here. Good morning, Jake, and welcome to Conflict Managed.
Morning, Mary. How are you?
I'm great. I'm so happy to be talking with you this morning and to hear about all your very interesting experiences and also your take on leadership and, of course, conflict. But before we get to all of that, will you please tell us about the first job you ever had as a young person?
Yeah, so the first job I ever had, I worked for, let me be completely honest. The first job I ever had is I worked at McDonald's. So right before the Dresden McDonald's, so that's how old I am. I predate Dresden McDonald's. Right before the Dresden McDonald's opened, my dad had a friend whose wife was the manager over at the McDonald's corporate headquarters, the group that owned that McDonald's, and she got me a job, and so I was training over in Martin. It was a disastrous experience. I worked
Oh,
for one shift. I never went back. It was terrible. And so I tell people like I worked at McDonald's for like 8 hours. And so that's technically first job, but first job that I kept for any period of time is I worked in the summer between my sophomore and junior year of high school for the Board of Education, primarily with what is now the CTE programs. So Marvin Flat used to be the director of the county CTE programs, and I worked for Marvin, and more importantly, I worked for his assistant, Regina Sipes, and did filing and that kind of stuff. But a great summer experience that I loved. And so I've always said like, so I got my start in K-12 education in my career, and then that's transitioned to lots of other things.
well, I definitely want to hear about the juxtaposition of the disaster of McDonald's for 8 hours and then this wonderful summer job that you had. So I think everybody wants to know what happened and that this one shift that made you say, no, no, not for me.
Yeah, so I went in, and I can't even tell you the timing of year around all of that, but I went in, and by the when I started, they didn't have a uniform for me, so I was in plain clothes behind the counter, which started off bad, and then I had a cold to some extent, and so I was coughing, and so coughing into my arm the entire time, and you had people both in front of the counter and behind the counter that had a lot of concern around my coughing. And like at one point somebody told me like, you better get that together. Like you can't be coughing. And I was like, well, what am I supposed to do? Like I can't run out every time I need to, cough. And I just thought like, this is bad. This is not for me. I do not need to be doing this. And so then I was scheduled for like a morning shift a couple of days later, and before I went in, like sitting in the parking lot, like I called and was like, I I'm not gonna be able to make it. This isn't for me, and it was like terrible. I still feel bad about the whole thing. I now realize like they had scheduled me to work. Like they had to probably call somebody in because some kid didn't show up for work. And so it was just, I still laugh about how disastrous it was.
You know, that is such an interesting story because it tells us about a variety of things. First, the importance of onboarding, right? So, you know, in particular, somebody who is young, who's never gone through the process, who doesn't really know in a way how to take care of themselves if they're not feeling their best self or how to advocate for yourself. But the whole thing, I mean, why are you at the front on your first day? You are in street clothes, you clearly aren't feeling well. How do we come alongside and make the first day the best day and really show that person the ropes? So, I mean, I'm sure that's been pretty informative when you think about somebody joining your team. Um, so bad experiences can be very, very informative of what we
For
choose to
sure.
do differently.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And so, what about your first real then job working at, and you said you had a really good experience. What specifically working for Regina and others that resonated with you that really worked for you?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of that experience was about the environment, and so it was a really fun group. So again, really interesting when you think about the transition to what later careers I had, and that I was in and out of that building in my last career prior to what I'm doing now, all the time, interacting with a lot of the same people who had seen me as this 16-year-old kid who now is, the mayor, and interacting in a much different capacity. But really, it was a great environment. It was I still like really can like laugh with a whole lot of those people. So keep in mind, one of the things I'll tell you is I've always been an old soul until I got to this point, and now I feel like now I'm trying to transition back into a young soul. So now I feel like I am old trying to be young, but then I was young trying to be old. And so really kind of sitting around a table primarily with women, all in their careers, most of them in an administrative or assistant role. And so very much kind of the boots on the ground as it pertains to summer, especially when you think about the education system, and most everybody's gone. And so, really, a great environment where they kind of embraced me and brought me into the fold. And then Regina was a great supervisor. So, she's a whole lot of fun, which was really great for me because I like to have a good time. But also, like, very clear understanding, like, there is work to be done. I'll tell on her now, almost probably 30 years removed. Like, I did a whole lot of work for her that she didn't want to do. We still joke that there are probably cards under her desk that need to be filed that she never wanted to file. And so I spent a lot of time filing like I won't say permanent records, but report cards and absentee cards and those kind of things. But really a great experience primarily because of the environment.
Right. And isn't that the way that it goes, independent of the kind of work? Because I have interviewed people who their work at McDonald's, because that's the first job for a lot of people, was fantastic. And, of course, the work that we do does matter, but just as important, if not more, is what is the environment? What does it feel like? Do I have a sense of belonging? And it certainly sounds like you had that there, that you had a feeling they wanted you and you
Mhm.
got to do important work and it was a easy environment, a good environment to be in.
Yeah, absolutely. Culture is so important
Yeah.
in work.
So where'd you go from there?
So after that, I spent a little time. My grandfather owned a real estate company, and that's really where I spent the majority of my adolescent years, high school, even into college, and spent some time there in the office. Ultimately, got my real estate license when I turned 18. Came over to Martin, started over here to get my undergrad degree. Still stayed at my granddad's real estate office for a period of time, and then kind of made a decision. Both of us made a decision. He allowed me to go be successful somewhere else. Very interesting story there too. But made a decision that we kind of parted ways unceremoniously, and I made the determination of I could sit and kind of be upset about this scenario, or I could go out and find a new job. And ultimately, what I did was, is there was a men's store right on the square, same square that my granddad's real estate office was. And I walked in to Mr. B's and talked to Mike Parrish, who was the owner, and said, "Hey, Mike, do you have, are you looking for anybody?" And he said, "Well, actually, I think I could work you." It was right. It was December, so it was right before the Christmas rush. And that very next day, it had snowed. And so my granddad's administrative assistant walked out of the office, and there I was across the square shoveling snow, kind of turning my nose up to say like, I'm gonna be okay. I can do other things. And so spent a real quick time there. That store ultimately closed in May of that next year. And so I worked through the transition of that store closure. I didn't know that when I took the job. And then from there, I got offered a part-time position because I was just about to finish up my last year of college with Simmons Bank. They offered me a part-time position in their corporate office in deposit management. Jennifer Revis hired me while I was in college. And I did not want to go to work at a bank. I had resisted going to work at a bank for several years. I had family in banking and I had really resisted that, but needed a job. And so I took it. And that's ultimately where I landed from a permanent career. So after I graduated college, I landed there and spent almost 10 years in the Dresden market. So they hired me in the Dresden market when I graduated from college, and that's where I spent the first part of my actual big, what I call my first actual big boy job.
What an interesting path, when you think about the different things that you did, from education to real estate to clothing to banking, and then you were a mayor for a decade, and now you're
Right.
chief of staff at the University of Tennessee at Martin. Uh, it seems like all of those experiences, I would think in particular when you're the mayor, you're interacting with all different kinds of people. I mean, the community, which is
Mhm.
every kind of person. And so having that variety of experience. And I also imagine, obviously this parting way with your grandfather's business sounds like it was, I'm sure, painful at the time, but those no's help us to understand life, help us to make decisions. As you said, I can either fall apart about this or pick myself up and decide, nope, I'm doing something else.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so I do think like there's purpose in everything. I am a believer there's purpose in everything. You don't know what that is necessarily in the moment. I really don't know where I would be had I stayed in the real estate office. I was terrible at selling real estate. That's a really interesting dynamic. I was really bad about it. I'm not a high pressure sale. I was really great in the retail space. Like if somebody came in, I knew they wanted a shirt, I could sell them a shirt, and then I could also sell them a tie and maybe a sports coat and a pair of pants and all of those kind of things. So retail was really kind of in my sweet spot at the time, where like high pressure sales, not what I was going to be great at. But really and truly, it was because that then led to this trajectory of like then having to get the job at the bank that ultimately ended into this actual career after college. That then I go back to and say, I would have never been able to be mayor had I not both had the experience at the bank, this understanding of how to deal with people and how to deal with conflict, and also being able to be very active and engaged in the community. That created a real great transition for me to say, like, you've seen me do this community work. Now let me go out there and lead the community. And so it really was this transition that said, like, oh, all of that made sense and landed me at the place of being the mayor. And now I go back and say, like, I would never be in the position I am with the university had I not had the experience in the mayor's seat. I don't think those things happen in a vacuum or a bubble. They all happen because of each other.
Yes, and that's why I think it's so important to really encourage people to have a variety of experiences, whether it's different kinds of jobs, different volunteering in the community, different for younger people, internships. And the more experiences we have, the more we're able to make informed decisions about what we like and what we don't like, like your resistance
Right.
to work at the bank. And then there are, these 10 years, which I'm sure were very informative and that you grew. And so tell us about that, about what you thought the bank was going to be like and what it turned out to be.
Yeah, so I mean, I really in my head prior to going there, like I thought, oh, a bank job sounds terrible. That sounds so boring. I do not want to do that. That sounds awful. Like I said, I landed in a spot early on that was different than being what in my mind I thought, a teller, and that just sounded miserable to me. Ultimately what it did is so deposit operations deals with tellers and customer service reps, and so I ultimately was a roving teller for a period of time. I've worked at First State was where I worked, now Simmons, but I worked in branches all over West Tennessee, and spent even a little time in Belle Meade. We had a branch there for a period of time. I was the head teller for the first week that they opened, so spent a lot of work behind a teller line, which I ultimately did really enjoy. Customer service was really kind of where I landed when I started in the branch market. I was a relationship specialist, and so customer service because also like had determined I didn't want to loan money because I didn't think I'd be any good at telling somebody no, and somebody was going to walk in with a terrible sob story, and I was going to give them a loan, and then they weren't going to pay it back, and and I didn't want, because I am, to be perfectly honest with you, conflict averse, and so like the thought of having to collect and all of that sort of stuff. Now, I had a great supervisor at the bank. Jennifer Revis was a great supervisor. Andrea Hughes was actually my boss for the longest period of time at the bank. Fantastic boss, mentor. And she told me really early on, like, if you want to do this deposit stuff, great. I think you're really good at it. But I'll tell you, like, the success in a bank, like, the through line is through lending. There are very few people that can do deposits their entire career. Lots of people lend money and ultimately work their way through the management system. And so she changed my perspective on that. And so I said, like, I'll go out there and do that. And like, when I finished at the bank, like my bread and butter was consumer lending, was people coming in saying, I need a car loan, or I need to borrow some money on on my house, or I need to, pay off some credit card bills, that sort of thing. I do still say this today. I think one of the best jobs everyone could have is working in a bank, because you see the way people manage money, and you learn like what not to do, like how people get themselves into really terrible situations. And so that really does make an impact on the way we think through, or the way I now think through managing money. And so that was really impactful for me as well.
Yeah. As we mentioned earlier, culture is so very important, and you have had two at the bank, two manager and boss that were very um, impactful to you. And one thing that you mentioned that's very specific that other people can take is helping your people see the lay of the land, right? So you have people coming into your organization, and they may have one idea of what they want to do and they want to be successful. But they may just not understand how this business works or how this org works. And some managers just won't tell you. They're not taking that kind of active interest. And so that is something very specific that managers and bosses can do, is really talk with and figure out, where does this employee want to go, and how can I help them grow so that they can achieve their goals, which is good for the person, it's good for the organization. So can you tell us some other specific things that mentors or bosses have um, helped you along your path of development?
Yeah, so one of the things I continue to talk about, and my relationship with Andrea Hughes is so interesting, because she was really, until now, Chancellor Freeman, like she was the last boss I had, because then when I became the mayor, I didn't have a boss. Like there wasn't anybody to answer to. Now I had lots of friends and fellow mayors that I would talk to, that and certainly have had some mentors along my career as mayor, but really Andrea was kind of the first person that I would consider as being a true mentor. And she gave me some really good advice in my time at the bank. One of the things she always told me is if you're good, you don't have to tell people; they'll know it already. And so, kind of this humility aspect. So I did not come to the bank with the most humble attitude. I came into my early career thinking I was really, really good, and I was going to go out there and absolutely change the world. And she told me very early on, like, you don't have to tell people how good you are. If you're that good, they'll know it. Um, she oftentimes would say, be careful about that pedestal that you're on, because you'll turn around and you'll be knocked off of it. And so be very cautious of allowing others to raise you up, because you could at any moment screw something up, for lack of a better term, and you fall off, and those people are nowhere to be found in trying to raise you back up. John Clark was the CEO of the bank when I started. He had really grown the bank to pretty substantial success. And his relation, I didn't have a direct relationship with Mr. Clark at the time, but really and truly, his allowance of me to go out and run for mayor was really impactful. Seeing somebody that really, I mean, for to give context, like I was a very valued employee. I think most people would have identified me as somebody that was going to progress through the organization and potentially be a leader in the organization later in life. And so to say, like, we're willing to let that asset go in order for him to go and pursue something else. I saw Andrea say time and time again, like when people made decisions about changing jobs or moving to different departments, like, I'm not going to do anything that diminishes your ability to go out there and be more successful. And so those were all kind of like little lessons that I learned, if not from a direct instruction, but really from an observation of how some of those early leaders in my life managed people, managed relationships that really kind of, as I looked back and even hearkened back to how I interacted with employees later that I supervised as mayor, to say, when somebody would come in and say, like, I think I'm going to make a change, I want you to be successful. I love this relationship we have here, but I want you to go out there and I want you to be successful. And so I will support you in those efforts. Those were really things that I learned through my time at the bank.
What a gift to see that modeled. Yeah, when we think about servant leadership or people first, we are people first and employees or whatever somewhere down the line. And to really be a person for others, whether it's a colleague or you're just a colleague to colleague or it is your boss, but to really feel that's being gracious. That's not being selfish because selfishly, I'm sure she was thinking, no, no, we rely on you. This is going to be difficult for me. It's going to be difficult for the organization. It's going to cost us money because it always costs money to do a search and rehire and train. And then the hole that's left when somebody with all that institutional knowledge and relationships leaves. So it really is. It does impact business personally with those relationships and financially. But to always be for people first is obviously humane, but it also in the long run makes good financial sense because the best word of mouth is employees who have left a place and said, you definitely should go there. That is a good place to work. It's a good place to do business. I want to do business with those people. So it's playing the long game. Being a good human always pays off.
Absolutely, absolutely. Another thing that I do think is important, worth mentioning, is so Andrea did tell me early on, is people bank with people.
Mm.
People don't bank with banks; they bank with people. Now that has transitioned, like those human connections, those human relationships, they matter. And so whether that's in banking or whether that's in public service or now whether that's in the UT institution, like I understand like those relationships are important, and having and being humane and treating people with respect and being willing to make accommodations and to bend over backwards to help somebody, like all of those things are impactful and important when you're trying to be successful in whatever it is.
Yes, and we always, we know how we feel around people. When I'm around this person, how do I feel? Do I feel valued? Do I feel seen? Do I feel like I'm a bother? Do I feel like I don't matter? And that has so much to do with how much effort we're going to put into this relationship, whatever it might be. And when we think about maybe authentic networking, it's sometimes I think networking definitely gets a bad rap, like it's slimy, like we're just out here using each other. That's not really networking. Networking is how do we have these reciprocal relationships? I help you, you help me, but we're perfect. We're people first, right?
Mhm. Right.
And but we can help each other when we know about each other. And so I wanted to ask you about this because I'm curious. I love the sentiment that you don't have to tell people how good you are, right? They will see. Your work stands for yourself. And yet you have to tell your own story, right? So I was at UTM for a long time in the philosophy department, and the philosophy department does excellent work. It's a small department. And philosophy departments are closing around the country because philosophers are terrible about telling their story. They're terrible about saying all the good work they're doing because in a way they think, well, my scholarship should speak for myself, the fact that I interact with students. But if nobody knows, then nobody sees. So how do you balance that? that practical advice for leaders and just people of, I do need a certain amount of self-promotion, but not ego, not putting myself on a pedestal. How do you balance that?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly, I will say, like, I have not been perfect in that scenario, because while I have tried to come to things with humility, like I'm also a little bit of a, I'm a lot sometimes. I'm not everybody's cup of tea, and part of that is because like I am a little bit kind of out there and upfront. I do think it's really important. To be able to kind of push yourself out there. I read a book one time, how to toot your own horn without blowing it, and really this concept of like, how do you find that balance of making people understand that you do have value, that you can bring something to the table, that you are potentially better than other candidates or applicants, and and so talk about like that really 10 years ago, or 11 years ago now, of going out there and trying to sell yourself. I mean, my degree is in business administration with a focus in marketing. Like that's really what I thought I wanted to do, was be in a marketing department. I wanted to be Don Draper. But what I ultimately learned is nearly everything is sales. And so I spent an entire year selling myself and why I'm the best candidate to go out there and be the mayor, and talk about like really challenging when you also like in the back of your mind think like, is that message going to resonate? Is that what people actually want? Are the things that you're selling actually the things that somebody wants to buy? Um, and then also then saying like, okay, well, what do you think this job is? And saying, well, the job is going out and selling Weakley County. And so how do we go out there and tell our story around why we think Weakley County is the best county to be in? I think part of being able to find that balance is both having a belief and then having actual data to back up why you actually are the best at what you do. Is that it's not just pontification, it is not just being boastful, it's like like being able to talk the talk and walk the walk. I think that's really important. That's the best way that I kind of correlate. I do think that I'm really good at this, but let me show you all the reasons why I am good, the proof positive in being that good. And we run into that now. They were doing it before I got here, but I'm being very intentional about saying like we have to tell the Martin story as well. That we do some things really, really well, and we have to go out there and tell that story, because what we would love to believe in most scenarios is again back to that model of if you're that good, people will just know it. And I don't think you have to go out there and you have to tell that all the time, but you do have to present it to them. You do have to make sure that information is in front of them. And so we're not going out there and saying like we are the best institution in the country. We're going out there and saying we're a really great institution. This is why, and this is how we think you fit into what we do here. And so finding that balance around trying to figure out how to best effectively tell that story and making sure people just know it, and then they can make the determination of, is it the best?
Yeah. Right. And I think that's a really good point. And we make informed decisions if we have the information. And so whether that's about a place to live, a place to go to school, or just whether or not you are good to work with as a client, or we need to present that information. And so I think it is really trying to figure out what that balance is. So tell us about the move and the kinds of challenges that you faced going into public service, being mayor of a county. Um, in a way, you have no boss and everyone's your boss. Everyone has an opinion, and nobody has the facts like you do. And they shouldn't, because that is your job. So what was that like serving a whole county?
Yeah, I mean, it really was interesting. So the first aspect of that is like I had gone from being very much supervised to being my own boss to supervising other people that I had really not done. I had a couple of loan assistants in my time at the bank, but ultimately, like they in a hierarchy, like it was more of a dotted line than a solid line, and so like taking on staff and managing people. And I think anybody that you talk to will say like the hardest part about being the boss is the management of people. It's just really, really challenging. And I had a very small staff. And so like not a whole lot of management, but really and truly like trying to figure that out. And then, yeah, one like you walk into it thinking that you've spent a year campaigning and you think you absolutely know everything there is to know about what you're going to do. And then you get there first day and figure out, like, oh, none of what I actually thought was going to happen is happening. And people don't just automatically start saying, like, oh, well, now you're in charge. So you just do it however you want to, and we'll follow your lead. County government's even more interesting in that dynamic because you work with a lot of different other elected officials. So the county clerk and the register of deeds and the trustee and the sheriff and the road supervisor, and all of them have complete autonomy themselves. They're all independently elected. And so I'm not their boss. So I don't get to go in and tell people in the courthouse like what to do. Those individuals are making decisions on their how they want to run their offices. The call we probably got the most was is like or the call that we struggled with the most is I've got my road needs work. I've got a pothole in front of my house, and I was like, I can't, like, not only am I not in charge of that, like I can't tell the road supervisor he's got to come and pick that pothole, even if I think it needs to be fixed. And so figuring out how to work with people where it really is less about authority and more about influence. What influence do I have? Legislative bodies and county commissions and those kind of things, working with those individuals that have very clear authority on appropriations and how we spend our money. And I have no say in that. All I do is advocate for where I think that we need to put those appropriations. And so creating some relationships, creating trust, in trying to go out there and tell and show people like I have a knowledge base around this, and this is why you should listen to me on those kind of things, was a really different kind of transition there. And then just like an expectation that you are to be all things to all people to some extent. That most of the time people didn't show up in the county mayor's office to tell you what a great job you were doing. They showed up to lodge some sort of concern or complaint. And so
Yeah.
how do you deal with that? And in a lot of those scenarios, like the answer was never clear cut and yeah, absolutely, we'll go out there and do that, all of those kind of things. And so really interesting transition where previously, the answer is either yes, we are going to give you this money, or no, we're not going to give you this money. And obviously we tried to work through scenarios, but it's just a much different kind of way of looking at and managing scenarios.
That's interesting because today when we think about what is the what are the sort of the best kinds of office environments, and they're collaborative. It's this top-down, authoritative, my way, and you're all my minions. I mean, that's just outdated, and people want to be treated as adults. They want to come to the table. And it's one thing to do that voluntarily. It's another thing, like that's what your job is. Your job is to collaborate, to make those relationships, and that means it's give and take. It's listen to what the needs are, making those, and then being able to articulate to that upset person in your office as to how they can be empowered to move forward or what they can do, or, you know, bringing their concerns into now the mix of how you then go out and speak to other people to advocate. So tell us a little bit about how you developed becoming boss with a straight line, right? So not just this dotted line, because even if you just manage one person, it's a big responsibility because it's about their life and their livelihood and how they interact with how they feel at their job, and then it goes into their family and their community. So was it sort of a baptism by fire, or how did you come to where you are today when you think of as a leader?
Yeah, so every scenario is different. Every person you manage is different. We all have different attitudes. We all have different needs. You have to figure out like what those needs of that person is. Sometimes you can't deliver, and I'll be really honest. Sometimes you can't always deliver on what that person needs, and that's okay too. In the big scheme of things, in the big picture. So I came to the office. I had my very first administrative assistant as county mayor had been there. Beverly had been there 8 years prior to me. She came with Houston Patrick, who had been my predecessor, who retired before I took office. Beverly was a longtime family friend, still is a friend to this day. And so managing that relationship, Beverly was had seen me growing up. Her son was 4 years older than I was, and so she really was like for all practical purposes old enough to be my mother, and had had kind of a motherly relationship in previous life, and so coming in and trying to figure out that dynamic while also understanding like she had a lot more institutional knowledge than I did,
Mhm.
around how the job worked. Also in like thinking through we're making transitions in the way that the office operates, and I need you to be on board with that. One of the first things we struggled with was is I make this joke that so I was the youngest county mayor in the state at the time when I was elected. I was 30 when I was elected. Houston had been 80 when he left office. And so very different, just approaches to the
Mhm.
office. I tell people like we went from an apple a day, keeps the doctor away, to an Apple operating system. And so and Beverly had a paper calendar, and I was like, if it's not in my phone, it's not going to happen. Like that's just a change. And so that was some immediate kind of conflicts that you started to
Yeah.
see. And then and Beverly ultimately decided she wanted to retire. I knew when I went into the office, like she was close to talking about retirement, and so she worked for me for 2 years, and then after that, I had a continued to have this great success around executive assistants, who supported me in my role, who I helped try to support them in their roles. I had a great working relationship with a young woman named Erica Moore, who was really has become one of my very favorite people in the whole world, because we just worked so well together. And we are very different people. We operate very differently. We approach scenarios very differently, which is one of the things that I absolutely love about a working relationship is people coming with different perspectives and different ways of operating, that essentially can complement each other. But ultimately, I go back to like you became friends with those people, and there is a balance there of I'm your friend and I'm also your boss, and we are coworkers, and there has to be some pretty clear defined roles and responsibilities and understanding. But ultimately, like I go back to at the end of the day, what people really want at work is they first they want to be valued. Like that's number one. But secondly, they really want to have a good time. They want to enjoy coming to work every single day. And so like I am constantly trying to create an environment where people enjoy being around me. If I can be a joy to be around, then that helps elevate the environment in which we operate. The culture just becomes better. And so really being thoughtful around that. I also go back to so whether it's direct management or whether it's indirect kind of conversations, again around like other officials, I never went in and said like I'm the mayor and we're going to do it this way. It was this collaborative work with also giving people an opportunity to say like we will let you make that decision. One of the, I think one of the best things that my bunch ever said, and I worked with a great group of elected officials. I'll say like we had the best elected officials in the state. Decisions around like closure for snow, like everybody had the ability to make their own decisions related to their office. They really did start to enjoy somebody saying, like, let's talk about what that looks like, but ultimately I'll make that decision and then I'll take whatever kind of repercussions happen on that. Like, I'll take that bullet. And that was not the only scenario when we talked about raises for employees or going out there and trying to get appropriations from the county commission. Like, somebody at times has to be that champion, but you have to create an environment where people feel like their voice is heard in that conversation.
Yeah, that is such a wonderful point because not only do we want people to feel like their voices are heard, their voices really matter, right?
Absolutely.
We are gonna make better decisions where we hear from more than just what's going on inside our minds,
Hmm.
right? We're in a position because hopefully we're in this position because we are suited for it and we have the experience. But a part of that experience is knowing we don't know everything. We don't see every part. We don't see how this decision is going to affect this pocket or that pocket. But hopefully there's somebody on our team that does or who can find that out. And so we can really make thoughtful, especially if we're talking about a county, it affects so many different people in ways that we may not see because it's not within our experience. And so um, I think what's important when we think about diversity on a team, there's lots of ways to think about diversity and lots of different ways of thinking about collaboration. And true collaboration is never lip service. Because anyway, that just destroys morale, but really thoughtful consideration of how do we make that best decision for everyone, which we get a better decision and then we strengthen our working relationships for the next thing down the road.
Right. Absolutely.
So, when you think about conflict, and so I want you to maybe tell us about a conflict you had earlier in your career, and then, being maybe conflict averse or is difficult, yet it's just normal. It has to be done. That's a part of excellent leadership is making, as you said, those hard calls and dealing with it. So, can you tell us about something earlier on, what happened and how you dealt with it, and then maybe where you are now?
Yeah. So one of the biggest mistakes I ever thought I made as county mayor is so again 30 years old, um, but really thought like ultimately understood that that is really what the community I think thought that they wanted when they elected me is a change in the way that we were operating. I think they enjoyed this thought around talking about, oh, I'm going to be out there and active and aggressive and really going out and promoting the community and the ability to do that in a really kind of engaged way. And so I really thought like there was a conversation to be had with other community leaders across the state around like getting engaged, young people being a part of the process, a diversity of thought, a diversity of what county commissions and county mayors and elected officials look like, school boards, city boards, all of that sort of stuff. And so I spoke to a leadership group in a neighboring county, and I made a joke that still I was to this day say had some truth to it of like they had participated in a leadership program and this was now their opportunity to go out and get engaged in the community. That's really where I thought my through line had been in my early career, and this was an opportunity for them. And I said, like, because you all have got to do this, because if you all don't do it, who is? And I said, and I'm sure that your county commission looks like my county commission, like multiple county commissions across the state, a bunch of old white guys. And there was a local newspaper that published all of my comments. But while I was on vacation, that story hit, and one of my county commissioners saw it in a neighboring community's newspaper and then shared it with the rest of the bunch. And I immediately thought like, so again, I don't necessarily take back the statement because I did believe that and still believe that. And it was true. The average age of my county commission at the time was about 70 years old. And they all looked the same, with the exception of a woman on the commission who was resigning at the time, and we replaced her with a white guy. And I was like, that's bad. That's bad practice on you all's part. Um, but it wasn't untrue. But what I did ultimately realize is like it was inappropriate for me to make a joke at their expense. And then I spent a lot of time apologizing and trying to repair relationships. And one of those commissioners will still bring it up when I see him or to other people. He's never really gotten over the joke, and that is completely fine. I respect that his thought there because I did make a joke at his expense. And what I learned in that was is that regardless of what I think, there's a way to have a conversation with people. There's a way to talk about tough scenarios or talk about change. And then there's a way not to do that. And that's a lesson I still learn because I do still like to poke fun and make light of things. But ultimately, at times, those jokes are not going to hit the same way that they do for me that they will for somebody else, especially somebody else that thinks that they're the butt of that joke. And that was really the first time where I thought like, whoa, I've really messed up. And then how do you work through that? Because I wasn't working through it with just one individual. I was working through it with 18 individuals, all of which came to it from various different aspects. Some of them thought it was funny, some of them didn't, some of them like didn't could care less, you know. I was just some kid spouting off. And so really that taught me a really great lesson early on. And like also being mindful of the room. Like, I did I know the newspaper was there? Yes. Did I, in my wildest dreams, think they were going to publish every single thing I said? Absolutely not. Great lesson. Like, who in here's with the media? You know, I mean, having these conversations, like there's a part of me that is now very much in tune to this is going to be out there in the world. Be careful about what you say because words matter. What you say about people matters. And whether it's intentional or unintentional, perception is reality.
It's such a great example because as you were saying it, I live in this area too, and um, that drives me crazy, the homogeneousness of a lot of the elected officials who are making decisions for all of us. And yet so I hear that joke and it lands for me, and yet I understand why it's frustrating for other people because they're like, yeah, I might be an old white guy, but what about me? You know, why
I have
can't
value
I be
too.
here? I
Right.
have value. I have three sons that are white, you know, and I think,
Mhm.
well, okay, I want them to be able to participate in government. Um, and so like I can just see all of those layers and see how what your intention was and who you're talking to, and then how it gets translated, being offended, not being offended, thinking Jake's on our side, thinking Jake is against us, and where it is just sort of this innocuous, almost passive aggressive statement in one way, and not in another way, but just, yeah, the things that we say, because that should be a tough conversation that in Tennessee, the state that we live in, the United States, because this podcast is international, you know, that is something that really we all need to consider that our elected officials reflect the population because the community is for everyone. But if it's just a bunch of whatever color women, whatever age men, we're not going to be able to make really decisions that are going to be the best for the constituents if we don't have those voices, and not just a voice that comes to a meeting, but a voice in a position of power. And so you're right. Those are good, difficult decisions that need conversations that need to be had, but I think humor also tells us, oh, we are touching on something. And humor is, I think, also a good way to think, oh, well, maybe we do need to spend some time on this.
Right. Absolutely.
Wow, what a hard lesson, but sometimes sometimes those lessons the only way through is through. We don't know until we know.
Absolutely.
And while as quote unquote mistakes go, that was fairly small. I'm sure, we've all made bigger mistakes. I'm not going to ask you to air all your dirty laundry. But dealing with conflict, and especially for those people that we manage, they desperately want us to show up for them. And in our offices, it can be really hard because we have made friendships, or in small towns, they know our mother, or
Hmm.
it's difficult, especially when we have humanized the people around us, to
Right.
have those conversations or to let somebody go. Um, So what is your philosophy of conflict management now?
Yeah, so I really did, and it's really interesting. Every time you make a transition, it gives you an opportunity to kind of reevaluate and readjust, and that is something that I've tried to be very intentional about in this new role with the university because there's a lot of conflict involved in this new role. Most of the time people don't call the chief of staff's office or call the chancellor's office to also tell him what a great job he's doing. There's normally some issue. And it's an organization that has lots of people, and lots of people, more problems, that kind of philosophy. And and I'd gotten to a place because I was conflict averse in the county mayor's office where I'd taken approaches early on, and sometimes it's hard to dig out of that way of operation, or people start to make some assumptions and they start to make decisions based upon those assumptions. And so when I came to this role, now that I've been here 8 months, I really am trying to be intentional about saying, like, we're going to have really direct conversations, and an understanding that, like, not everybody is going to love those decisions. I'm obviously having to make different kinds of decisions, and having to give different considerations when you're an elected official because you want to try and keep the job. Where, like, in this job, like, I also really need to keep this job, but at times, like, making tough decisions or telling somebody no or upsetting people is going to be the thing that actually gives me the most value in the role that I currently sit in. And so really thinking, like, I want to be intentional about being honest with people, giving them answers as quickly as we possibly can, trying to resolve those issues. And resolution, what I classify as resolution is like saying, like, this is the decision we made and we're moving forward, not necessarily that we did the thing that you wanted to do. That's not what I classify as resolution. And so how do I do that most effectively? And so being very thoughtful and intentional about, we've made a decision, this is what we're doing. Now we can continue to have some conversations if you disagree with that, but ultimately this is where I think we're going to land on that.
I really appreciate that. I say in conflict, we want early, often, swiftly, justly. So many times we're just strung along because the people don't want to make us
Mhm.
upset or but I think that that damages individuals in the sense that just treat us like adults, let us know. And the fact of the matter is, if you're working someplace, you're going to be disappointed. You are not going to agree with everything. But it's harder when we're just sort of like waiting months on end. What is the decision? And so we're in a holding pattern because ultimately, if an organization we're working with says no to something that we think is a deal breaker, okay, well, now I know they're saying no. And now I'm going to make a decision about what I'm going to do instead of sort of this false hope, or it's can be very disempowering when you are waiting on and you don't know, and it's very mamby-pamby. But what do we want? We want to be treated like adults. This is the issue. This is why we're saying not now or no. But psychological safety is in any organization is the feeling that I have as an employee that you want to hear my voice and that I can speak up without any sort of negative repercussions. So I'm not going to get fired or sidelined. But that doesn't mean I get my way all the time, but that my voice is asked for, it is considered. And even if the answer is no, I still feel like they want me to continue to come to the table.
And I always, or at least I attempt to try and give people space to understand that when I'm making a request too. I say a whole lot of times to people, like, so I understand that no is an answer. And so I'm giving you space to also feel comfortable with not being concerned that if you say no, that you've affected my relationship with you either. Like, I'm walking into this with an understanding that, like, potentially the answer is no, and that's not, I'm looking for yes. And I do think that it's important to try and start from a place of yes, of like, let's figure out a way that we can do this. Ultimately, we may not can get to that place, but at least let's think through it from a place of yes, but also with an understanding that no, that ultimately we may be at a place of no. And if you give space to people in the decision-making seat to understand that you're okay with that no too, that's very helpful as you move through relationships and move through work and especially like interacting with each other in the future too.
Yeah. And I think if we continue to really think about what does it mean to have a humane working environment and the golden rule, how do I want to be treated? And clear as kind. In the South, we live in the South. And many times we dance around because we want to be polite. We want to spare people's feelings. That's good. We ought to be polite and not rude. We ought to be concerned with people's feelings. And so, but the thing is, it's not one or the other. Telling somebody the truth is kind. We're all trying to be better tomorrow than we were today. We're all on this journey of emotional intelligence. And emotional intelligence is being able to hear hard things and dealing with it and moving on, right? We learn from the no's. We learn we want the yes, but it's not always going to be the case. But the more I know I can trust you. So, Jake, if I go to you and I have this concern, and I really think this policy needs to be changed, and you come back and say, Mary, thank you for this concern. We have talked about it, but the reason why we're going to have to keep this policy is X, Y, and Z, and that's what we're going to do now. Well, I might think, well, that's the wrong thing for the institution to do, but you're now someone I can trust because I came to you and you came back to me and we had a conversation as adults. And it's okay that we don't agree. We ought not expect that. It's not realistic. It's not going to happen. But we can preserve our relationships and actually strengthen our relationships through being honest with one another in the right way, at the right time, with the right consideration.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So as you look into the future, so this is the question I'd like to end on, and you think about your children out in the workforce, what do you think needs to happen so that not only every employee is treated with dignity and respect, but more than that, they're encouraged to thrive and flourish?
Yeah, one of the things that I continue to go back and say is it's not what you say, it's how you say it. My two greatest pieces of advice sometimes is that, and just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do something. Like an understanding that while sometimes we have the ability to make lots of decisions, that does not necessarily mean that that just because you have the authority to do that means that you should do it. And then how do you communicate that out? Like, how do you tell people? How do you tell people no? Or how do you have difficult conversations with people? I think an understanding, and I'm going to get a little biblical here, but it's the way that I've tried to approach relationships of like I'm a believer that God created every single person, but more importantly, He created every single person in His image. And if I approach you in a conversation that you are made in the same image in which I am made in the same image, then we have some commonality. And if we are able to approach each other with this mutual respect, while we may not agree with each other, and like let's be really honest with Mary, like we may also really not like each other. Like that is okay too. Not everybody likes me, I'm not everybody's cup of tea. I am a lot. I'm a whole bunch, and that is not what everybody loves. But if we can at least come to the table with a mutual respect for each other, just at the base level of human beings, then we start with a foundation that allows us to build on how we move forward and have discussions with each other. And so I think those things are really important when we think about how we operate. I mean, I'm trying to show my kids, and most of the time unsuccessfully, of how we should treat each other, how we should think about scenarios. I mean, when I think about just issues that I have faced being mayor and now in this, like, how do we do this equitably? How do we do it where everybody feels like they're heard and that they're seen, and that nobody's going to get everything they want, but maybe everybody can get a little something that they want, is really important. And so just approaching scenarios like that, I think is will make us so much more successful. I think having culture in mind, what do we look like? And then again, back to the original point of like, and sometimes we can't say that, like, we can't tell people this is what the culture is. They're going to know it, they're going to see it, they're going to feel it. And so we've got to create that culture and not just say, like, this is what this is, because people are going to know it regardless of what we think or what we interpret that culture looks like.
Yeah, I think that's so true. The culture will out, right? So you don't need to say, "Oh, we are a great culture here." People feel it. They
Mhm.
feel, and then you also can see in the work that they do and how they show up for their constituents, their clients, whoever that might be. It shows in the work. You could feel it when you walk into an office. Do these people want to be here? Do they like each other? And therefore, they're going to get better work done, and then me as a client's going to be better off for it. I really do like this. It's so simple, and it seems like I mean, it's very commonsensical of let's just treat everybody as this baseline dignity and respect. I too believe that everyone has infinite value and worth, and my number one priority is to treat people with love. And if someone disagrees with me politically or on some hot topic like abortion or euthanasia or whatever, that is secondary to the fact that they are a human being that I owe basic dignity and respect to. And so if I am starting from that, it's okay if they don't like me. We're both fabulous, but not everybody's going to like that brand of fabulous. That's fine. I don't like everybody, most people, but some people just are not really for me. Even those people that drive me crazy, at baseline, if I decide I can vilify them or make fun of them or minimize them, that's a me problem. And so I
Right.
think you're right. We could always recalibrate me. How am I showing up? How am I valuing the other or othering people? And so in the future, if we want this good work environment in the future for everyone, that's not about the organization. I mean, it is a bit, but it's about the organization is made of people. How are the individuals showing up, which means how am I showing up?
Absolutely.
Well, Jake, thank you so much for sharing with us today. It's been so fun hearing about your experiences. And I wish you all the best of luck in your new role at the
Thank you, Mary.
university.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Have a great day.
Thank you. Take care. Our music is courtesy of Dove Pilot. And remember, conflict is normal and expected. Let's deal with it. Until next time, take care.